Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade your Retroid Pocket 3 to the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and we're going to do a shell swap as well while we're at it. Out of all the teardowns I've done, this one's not too bad. You definitely want to take your time with it. They also did send you a little toolkit, which is pretty helpful. Right, well let's jump into it and get started. Instead of installing the motherboard right away, we're going to work from the old stuff first and put this in probably last. It comes with the DPAD pre-installed, we're going to leave that there for now. First things first, let's get some of these ribbon cables unplugged so we don't have to worry about them later when we're pulling the parts out. I find the easiest way to get these out is just to use your fingernail and just unlock them. It works pretty easy and it should pop up right away. We're going to roughly go from the right side to the left side, pulling stuff out here, so let's take out the joystick first. There's only 2 screws holding those in. Set those aside so you don't lose those. The joystick is pretty easy to get out. Once you unlock the ribbon cable and take out the 2 screws, just pull it down and it should slide right out. Because the joystick opening is just a little too small here, you're not going to be able to put switch sticks in. It would have been a nice upgrade, but unfortunately the opening is a little too small for them. The right side control motherboard needs to come out next. There's only a couple screws, there's just 2 holding it in, and if you've unlocked the ribbon cable, it should slide out pretty easy. Just be careful with the switches on when you're pulling it out. I previously installed the conductive rubber upgrade kit on my D-pad here, so this is a little bit different than the one that's currently installed in the unit. This time around, I'm probably going to leave the dome switch D-pad and then the conductive rubber face buttons because that felt like the best combination for me. Make sure you don't get your parts mixed up so you remember which one is which. The conductive rubber face buttons look a little different on the back, so they should be easy to tell apart. You're welcome to pull the entire side out if you want to use that in your new unit and the old board, but I'm just going to use what they included. We might as well pull it out anyways. Make sure to unlock the other side of the ribbon here before pulling that out. Set that aside for later because we don't have any extras of that. Here's the new D-pad motherboard that was included in the kit. We're going to install that in the new unit. Make sure it's lined up correctly before you put it down, and make sure none of these little switches underneath the buttons get pushed off. They're very breakable, so you want to be very careful when you're setting this down. Need to make sure that the buttons on the outside are pushed fully out before you put down the board, or it will snap the switches off. If you do snap that off by accident, you luckily have a spare from your old unit that you can install. You can use the tweezers here when you're pushing it down just to make sure that the buttons are pushed fully out so it doesn't hit the switches when you're pushing it down. Once you think you got it properly seated, you can make sure that the switches work. You can just press them, and if you hear it click nice, then you know that side has been properly installed. I didn't have any foam behind my buttons on my old ones, so these ones feel a little bit different for me. I kind of like it a lot better. It feels a little bit higher quality with the foam behind there. I'm pretty sure these screw holes on the new unit aren't pre-threaded, so it is a little harder to screw them in. Before we remove the main motherboard here, we need to do a couple things first. First thing we need to do is to take out the speaker located at the bottom, or at least get the plug out here on the board. I kinda wish the plastic tweezers that they sent over in the upgrade kit are a little bit sturdier. These are kinda hard to use to remove plugs. In fact, the easiest thing I found for removing these small plugs is just your fingernail. If you just put it on each side and then pull down, it should come right out. With that unplugged, we're just going to use the tweezers here to pull it out of the way. Let's take this covering off the other speaker plug quick. I also figured out a nice trick to get the battery out pretty easy. I'll show you how to do that here. Instead of pushing from both sides, if you disengage the lock on one side and then pull up, it comes right out. I'm just going to pull up a little bit on the other side so it comes out evenly. You could use tweezers here to pull the rest out, but I tried from the center. It didn't work very well. I'd recommend just pushing it up from the side and it should pop right off. I feel like we're making a lot of progress here, so let's continue with the teardown. Next thing we need to do is to remove the antenna. This should come off pretty easy by sticking the plastic tweezers underneath and lifting up. There's quite a few ways to remove these ribbon cables, but honestly the best thing to do is just use your fingernail and pop them up. There's a lot plugged into the motherboard here. We need to make sure to unplug and remove everything before we start pulling up the actual board. The other speaker can probably come out now too, since that's also attached here. Alright, well that's everything on the motherboard. Now we just have to take these screws out and pull it up carefully. I'm going to get both of the controller boards out first before taking out the motherboard, since it's pretty easy to pull out. You need to start with removing the joystick here, since it's in front of the controller board on this side. The joysticks are pretty easy to get out. There's only 2 screws and the 1 ribbon lock. You want to keep these screws separate as they're a different size from the other ones in the unit. Unlock the ribbon cable with your nail and it should be out. All you have to do is just lift it up and pull straight down out of the ribbon cable lock and it should come right off. I'm always wary of removing batteries, but I've heard this is pretty easy to take off, so let's give it a try. You want a very wide, soft, flat tool to lift this out so it spreads the weight out evenly. I dropped mine behind here, so I'm going to have to use something a little bit bigger, and it worked out a lot easier, actually. You can use the tool that I lost to pull this up. I just find something like this is a little bit easier. Make sure to not pull the ribbon cable up, as there's a ribbon cable right underneath here, so just look under the side and make sure that you're only pulling up the battery. Lift up the battery very, very slowly so it has time to get the adhesive loosened. Again, taking a peek underneath to make sure that you're not pulling up any ribbons or cables, just the battery. That came out way easier than I thought it was going to come out. Let's pull this out of the way and you can see those ribbon cables underneath. These are something that you don't want to rip off, so just be very careful when lifting up the battery. You can see the adhesive on here is pretty strong and I'm struggling to get my tool back off of it. There are 2 ribbon cables back here. You only want to remove one. The other one is attached to the screen and that comes on the new unit. The bottom one here is the one you want to leave. There is a small amount of adhesive underneath this top ribbon cable, but it's pretty easy to get off if you take your time and just pull very slowly. While you're lifting it, make sure to push down on this other part so it doesn't peel it up as well. Lift up evenly on both sides, don't twist it like I'm doing here. This is definitely something you don't want to do because you can easily tear the ribbon cable. This is going to come off pretty quickly. Just make sure that the other side has already been unlocked because once you pull it, it's just going to want to come right off. We don't really need to get that glue off either. We can just leave that. We don't have to install this now, but I'm going to put it on the new unit. Watch the way I put this in so you can see the correct side up. Little bit of trial and error to get it in, but once it's in, all you have to do is just lock it. You definitely want to make sure that you put it in the lock straight, otherwise you're going to have to lift it up and reorient it. Not a big issue, and the glue on here isn't very sticky, so it's easy to pull it back up if you have any issues. Alright, let's get back to the old unit and removing the rest of the stuff in it. We're still going to have to remove these 2 speakers to put in the new unit as well. First things first though, we can remove the screws in the motherboard here so we can pull it up and out of the way. You can definitely tell this is ready to come out once those are pulled off. If it comes off easy, you know that it's ready to be lifted out. If you missed unplugging one of the cables or something, you're going to have to go do that first before lifting off the board. The little rumble motor sits behind the motherboard here, and it's pretty hard to get off. The adhesive is pretty strong. You're not going to probably be able to get it off with these little tweezers. There's also foam on the top of the little rumble motor here, so you can't really pull it off from there. There's really only one way to pull it off, and that's from the little solder point on the left side here. I'm just going to set this down for now, and we'll come back to this later. The speaker on this side is really easy to get out. All you have to do is just pull from the right side here and lift up, and it should pop straight out. There you go. Let's grab the other one too. I found this side a little harder to get out for some reason. I think the glue underneath it is a little stronger. Definitely don't pull from the right side here, as that's where the main speaker part is. You're going to have to probably pull from the left side and try to lift it out that way. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get this little piece out here. This must be some impressive glue. After some trial and error, I grabbed one of the tools from the kit, stuck it down the bottom part here, and lifted it up, and it came right out. You can see when I'm lifting it up, there's a little bit of glue here on the plastic part covering the circuitry. Set that aside for later. This is definitely something here, this little rumble motor, that we're going to come back and pull off in a bit. Before we put the new board down on the unit, make sure to pull off this tape on the back here so the adhesive goes on. Lift the ribbon cable back and make sure that the small wires are sticking out to the left side here on the opening part. You need to make sure that you stick these small wires through this little opening here. Looking back, I'd probably say just pull this little ribbon cable off right now until you get this motherboard down, then you can always reattach that later. Again, just a reminder when you're putting down the board to be careful with these small little switches. Once you're sure the motherboard is set correctly, you can go ahead and put the screws in now. There are quite a few of them holding the motherboard down, just make sure you put them all in. If you're finding the motherboard isn't sitting correctly, take a look at the bottom here. Chances are that the micro SD card reader is hitting the shell, so you'll likely have to pull up the board and reseat it. After pulling out the board and reseating it, you can see yes, it does fit a lot better now, and that didn't take much time at all to do. Let's put those screws back in, and it should be fine now. I'm just going to skim through this next part a little quicker since it's just me putting some of the screws in. On the old unit, they put the rumble motor wire underneath the ribbon cable, so we're going to install it the same way here. Lift up the latch, put the ribbon cable in, and make sure to lock it when it's in place. The ribbon cable has a little bit of a wobble in it here, but it's just because there's a little extra. Once you put the battery down, it will sit flat. This is totally normal. You can double check the other side if you want, just to make sure that it's correctly seated. I pulled mine out and just made sure before I put the battery on top. I wouldn't recommend installing the Wi-Fi antenna here now, just because when we put the battery down, it might get in the way, so let's leave that for now. We can put the speakers in next. Those are pretty easy, so they should just drop right in place and plug into the board. I was going to attach it here, but decided against it just since it's going to lean into the battery area. I figured it would be better to do it after. Obviously, we need to get the battery down next, so let's just get it out of the way and put this down. Make sure it lines up correctly and it's in line with the board before putting it down. The power cable's pretty stiff, so it might take a couple tries to get it in correctly, but it should go pretty easy. I used a small tool to lift it up so I could install it a little easier. As Retroid can't ship batteries separately in the mail, you need to be very careful not to wreck the plug here. The tweezers were pretty helpful here as they helped me get it aligned so I could push it into the board. It should lock nicely in place, and then we can move on to installing the Wi-Fi antenna. The Wi-Fi antenna is pretty easy to install. All you have to make sure to do is just put it straight over the plug and push down, and it should lock into place. There's a lot of small parts here, so it makes it a little difficult to install things correctly. Above all, just take your time with it and don't lose your patience. It takes a little while to get it correctly lined up, but once you get it on, it sits in there nicely. Wi-Fi antennas are pretty strong, and you do have to put a little bit of force in when you're pushing it down. I tried the back of the tweezers, but that wasn't enough force to push it on the slot correctly. Definitely just want to use your finger to push it on and lock it in place here. That seems to be the easiest thing. I twisted the Wi-Fi antenna over a little bit so it sits a little bit easier around the battery. The next part we have to install is the little ribbon cable between the main board and the small controller board. This is definitely the hardest ribbon cable to get on in the install process. I found it much easier to install if you just use the plastic tweezers as a guide underneath to line it up correctly. Then you can just bump it over on the side and it should fall right into place. There you go. Give it a quick check over to make sure it's correctly installed and it's locked in place. Flip the little lock over here and install the other ribbon cable now. Once you're sure it's in correctly, make sure to lock it. With that out of the way, we can install the speaker next. I started with this side as it was right there and I already had it in place. It shouldn't matter too much if the little speaker cable here sits over the battery somewhat. I don't think it's going to be affected when you put the back plate on. The other speaker can go in next, since that's one of the other things we need to finish off before closing the unit. I would definitely install the cable first before fully placing the speaker down. After that's in place, you can really see it's starting to come together now, and I think it looks great. I'm really happy to see a company like Retroid offer shell replacements and upgrade kits to their old units. It definitely offers quite a degree of flexibility. Double check to make sure that all the screws are in place. We don't want to miss any before we put the back on or the joysticks. You also want to check all the buttons to make sure they're clicky and that they're working properly before we close anything up. Everything on my unit looks good and it feels a lot better than the original. We've set aside their 2 joysticks, so grab one of those now and we can go ahead and put that in next. The little ribbon cable lock here needs to be flipped up so it's unlocked. I wouldn't recommend pushing it in like this. You need to grab your tweezers and you can install it that way. I'm not a big fan of these little ribbon cables, they're kind of a pain to install. The Retroid Pocket 3 is definitely one of the easiest units I've seen to work on so far. Everything just kind of goes into place and it's not too hard to take anything apart on it. Again, I just recommend not doing this the way you install them. Don't push the ribbon cables like this because you can really break them. You gotta be extremely careful with those, not to bend them like that. The plastic tweezers that they gave in the kit are extremely good at installing these, and it makes it a lot easier. Put those 2 screws in so the joystick's in place, and just double check to make sure everything else is screwed in on this side. As these holes here aren't pre-threaded, it does make it a little bit more difficult to screw these into place, but it should be fine once you start them. Looks good, and everything's locked in place. I'm going to do one more quick check just to make sure that the bumpers and all the buttons on the sides here are working correctly. It's definitely easier to work on the unit when it's already open, so if you notice anything now, you can go back and fix it before putting the back on. And even before we put the back on, I definitely would recommend starting up the unit just to make sure that it works correctly before going ahead and sealing it shut. If you accidentally put in one too many screws, you're going to have to take those screws off before you put the back plate on. There's only 4 screws that hold in the back plate here. The 4 in the middle are just holding the 2 sides of the back plate together. You don't actually have to remove that when you're taking it off your other unit. The back of the shell is the last thing that we need to install, so let's go ahead and put that on next. Line it up carefully and then start pushing the clips together at the top first. Follow the clips along the sides before proceeding to the bottom. You need to have the microSD card bay open, otherwise it won't close correctly. As always, it's good to check all the corners just to make sure that everything lined up and it's seating correctly in the locks. With the unit back together, you can see that purple looks amazing on this device. Definitely really close to the atomic purple from Nintendo. The 4 screws go in the back next, and that's the last thing that we have to do to get the unit together. Hopefully the video helped you and you managed to get everything swapped over okay. It's really cool to see a company like Retroid offer a lot of this stuff. As mentioned before, I'm really happy to finally see a company do this kind of stuff. Reusing your old unit to make a new one is definitely a great way to cut down on e-waste. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments section below. As I'm really close to the 1,000 subscriber milestone, make sure to subscribe so we can hit that by the end of the year. I really think you guys are going to have a lot of fun with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, just like I've been. Happy upgrading, everyone!